All right, so today we're going to go over some things about experimental design specifically. And so this is going to be kind of three sections that we'll talk about this. And so we'll focus first on some basic kinds of experimental design, including reviewing a couple of important terms. Then we're going to talk about within subjects and between subjects designs and thinking about kind of how we're assigning participants to our different groups and to our different conditions. And finally, we'll go over some more complex kinds of designs. And just like last time, you'll have some questions interspersed on Blackboard. I'll let you know when those come up. You can just hit pause, go answer that question on Blackboard, and then come back here to resume the rest of the lecture. So I'm just going to take a minute to share my screen with you. All right, so like I said, we're going to start out with just some important terms. Most of these will be some review. And so the first terms that we want to go over is an independent variable and a dependent variable. And we've talked about these several times this semester. We went over these briefly last class, and this is actually, since this is review, this is going to be your first question on Blackboard. And so you can just hit pause right now, go into the Blackboard folder for today, and you'll answer, what is an independent variable? What is a dependent variable? And so hopefully you answered those questions on Blackboard, since we'll go over the answers now. And so when we think about an independent variable, what's important to remember is that the independent variable is the variable that the researcher manipulates. This is the variable that the researcher decides what's going to happen. I'm putting these individuals into this group, and they're going to watch a movie, and we're putting these individuals into another group, and they're going to read a story. That's my manipulation, maybe if I'm comparing story reading to movie watching, and then that would be my independent variable in that case. My dependent variable, on the other hand, is going to be the variable that the researcher measures. And so, again, these terms are really specific for when we're talking about experimental studies. If we're doing a correlation or some kind of non-experimental version, we're going to talk about variables, but they're not going to have these specific terms associated with them because we're not manipulating anything. And remember, that's what makes experiments special, is that in a true experiment, the researcher is going to manipulate at least one variable, and that's going to be our independent variable. And our dependent variable then is going to be the one that's measured. So maybe my independent variable, I'm having one group of people watch a movie, one group of people read a story, and afterwards I'm going to measure how much they remembered about the narrative in either of these mediums. And so we can look at that, and whatever I'm measuring, this memory test that I'm giving, whatever score they get on that memory test, that's going to be my dependent variable. And so our next term here that we're going to look at is going to be a confounding variable. We've talked about these a little bit. These are very similar. We use them a little bit interchangeably with the term extraneous variable. And a confounding variable specifically is a variable that's uncontrolled for. And specifically, a confounding variable is an uncontrolled variable that varies with the independent variable. And this is particularly important because since confounding variables are intertwined with independent variables, at the end of our study, we aren't able to determine which variable had an effect on our dependent variable. So we can imagine that we're looking at this particular situation, and we have two different groups. We have a confounding variable, which maybe we aren't aware of, we don't think of at the time. And once we measure our dependent variable, when we run our statistics, we're going to be comparing these two groups, and we want to say something about how this manipulation we made of our independent variable influenced the dependent variable. And so when we want to make that claim, we want to be able to know that the independent variable was the only difference between our two groups. If the independent variable is the only difference between our two groups, then we can say confidently that the difference in the dependent variable between our groups is because of that manipulation, because of whatever situation we put those groups in. But if we have a confounding variable, now we have two things that are different between our groups. And so we can't say confidently then that it's because of our independent variable, because of the manipulation that we made. And so good designs really need to eliminate or control for all possible confounding variables. And that's a really important part of study design. And so if we don't know which of our variables, whether it was our independent variable or our confounding variable, that's causing the difference between our groups, this means that, there we go, that this is going to keep us from being able to draw cause and effect conclusions. And so our confounding variable is really going to be a problem for us, because usually our whole point why we choose an experimental method is because, as we've said in the past, an experimental method is the only method that allows us to draw cause-effect conclusions. And so if we have a confounding variable, that's going to keep us from being able to draw those cause-effect conclusions that we want to draw. So that brings us back to an idea that we talked about earlier in the semester, which is internal validity. And so when we talked about internal validity at that point in the semester, we talked about the fact that internal validity has to do with our ability to draw conclusions about cause-effect relationships from the data of our study. And so if we look at this definition of a confounding variable and this definition of internal validity, we can see that there's a relationship here. And so I'm going to ask you to pause in just a second and go on to Blackboard to answer your next question. And so thinking about the fact that a confounding variable is going to keep us from drawing cause-effect conclusions, and internal validity is going to be this ability to draw these kinds of cause-effect conclusions. I want you to think about, do we have, if we have confounding variables in our study, do we have high internal validity or low internal validity? And so think about that for a second. You can pause right here, go on to Blackboard. Remember that those Blackboard questions are participation questions. So in this case, it doesn't matter if you're right or wrong, but do the best you can with it. And then when you're done, you can come back here. We'll talk about this a little bit more. And so hopefully you answered that question. And so if we're thinking about this relationship between a confounding variable and internal validity, it's the case that if we have confounding variables, we have low internal validity, because those confounding variables are going to keep us from drawing cause-effect conclusions, and internal validity is then this measurement of how well we can draw these conclusions. So we have high internal validity if we have a strong ability to draw cause-effect conclusions from our data. We have a low internal validity if we have problems with drawing those kinds of conclusions. And since confounding variables are going to cause problems with drawing those kinds of conclusions, it means that our study will have low internal validity if we have confounding variables. So we'll move from here to thinking about some basic experimental design. And so in the very most basic experimental design, we're going to have participants that those R's in this diagram stand for randomization. So these are going to assume that we're randomizing our participants to either of our groups. And so in the very simplest experimental design, we're going to have our participants split into two groups, an experimental group and a control group. And these are going to be demonstrating the two levels of our independent variable. At the very simplest level, the very simplest kind of design, we're only going to have two levels of our independent variable. Remember that variables have to vary, and so we need at least two levels. We can have more, but for the basic kinds of design, we're only going to have two. So experimental and control, and we're going to assign our participants to these two groups. They're going to do something in these groups. So our experimental group is going to be getting the treatment or the manipulation or whatever else that we're trying to have our participants do as part of this manipulation. And the control group isn't. The control group is not going to get whatever this treatment or manipulation is. And then we're going to take a measurement, and this is our dependent variable, and this measurement should be the same for both of our groups, so that we can compare them. And so again, to recap that, we have one independent variable, at least two levels, but definitely two at the most basic level. And our dependent variable, just one dependent variable, one IV, one DV. And that dependent variable is only going to be measured once after our participants encounter our independent variable. And this is called a post-test only design. And that's because our measurement, our test, essentially, whatever we're measuring, we're looking at, and we can think this might be a survey or a questionnaire, this could be a test, maybe in our experiment, maybe we're studying some kind of educational kind of technique, and so maybe our control group just has a standard class, and our experimental group has this new version, this new teaching method, maybe. And so they get that teaching method, our control group doesn't, and then they all take the same test. That would be one version of this kind of post-test only design. And this is a post-test only design because we only have one test, and it's happening after our independent variable is encountered by our participants. And again, it's very important that this post-test, this dependent variable, is measured in both groups in the exact same way. Because again, we want to make sure that everything is consistent with the exception of our independent variable, of that manipulation that we're making. And if we've controlled for any potential confounding variables, if it's true that the only difference between our groups is our independent variable, is that manipulation, then after we've done our post-test only design, we can draw a cause-effect conclusion between the independent variable and the dependent variable. Our next experimental design is going to be what we call a pre-test post-test design. And so this is going to build on this design that we just encountered, that post-test only design. And so if we think just about these names here, we're going from a post-test only design to a pre-test post-test design. These are going to be really similar. All we're going to add in now is another measurement, another test. And this pre-test is going to be encountered before the independent variable. And so here we see a diagram, and this is from the textbook. We see a diagram of this pre-test post-test design. And so again, we're measuring our dependent variable, but now we're measuring it twice. So we still have one independent variable. We see that right in the middle in the white section. Independent variable, we still have at least two levels, at least an experimental group and a control group. Again, we can have more. It would still be a pre-test post-test design if we had more than two levels of our independent variable, but we only have one independent variable. And again, we still have only one dependent variable, but in this case, it is being measured twice. And specifically, this is going to focus, I'm going to move myself over here for a second. This is going to focus on change between the pre-test and the post-test. So we're going to be able to see the differences here between how people responded, what those measurements were from before the independent variable to what those measurements looked like after our participants encountered this independent variable. And so why would we want to do this? Why would we want to focus on the change between our pre-test and post-test? What is the benefit? We're making more work here for our participants and for ourselves, adding another measurement of our dependent variable. But we'd want to do this because this kind of design allows it to be possible for us to make sure that our groups were in fact the same to begin with. So if we go back for a second to our post-test only design, we separate our groups, our participants into our two groups, and then they encounter some kind of manipulation and we measure them. And in that case, we're going to make the assumption, we've talked about assigning participants to groups before, we've talked about the idea of randomization, and we know that randomization, and particularly randomizing our participants, is a control procedure. Essentially, it allows us to make sure that everything is equal. When we randomize our participants, if we have a truly random sample, and we know that those are really rare, but if we have a truly random sample, we know that at the beginning of our study, if things have been randomized, then both of our groups should be approximately the same in most ways. If we took the average of the ages of our participants, if we looked at the average intelligence of our participants, if we asked them to rate how interested they were in the topic we're studying, all of these kinds of things should be approximately the same if we've truly randomized our participants. But again, we know that sometimes this isn't the case, and by chance, sometimes even the randomization might not be perfect. And so by using a pre-test, post-test design now, we can actually look at the start and measure people before they encounter our independent variable to say something about the characteristics of our study. So maybe we're studying memory, and this measurement that we're giving people is going to have something to do with how much they remember of some situation, or based on whatever the situation that we put them in our independent variable, those levels of our independent variable. But we know that people in general have a lot of variability in their memory abilities. And so we might want to give give our participants some kind of memory test to begin with, to just be able to see what their memory ability is like to start. And then we can introduce our independent variable, and then we can take that into consideration to make sure that our groups really do look the same at the beginning of the experiment. Again, usually we don't need to do this. If we've randomly assigned our participants, then we can probably skip this. We can probably use that post-test only design. But again, we talked about how random assignment is really rare. Oftentimes we're using convenience samples, and our samples are not truly random, and it might not be possible to randomize our participants in that way. And so it really might be a good idea, when we don't have that random assignment, to use a pre-test, post-test design. Especially when we're using randomization, you know, kind of the more participants that we have, the better this works. So especially if we have 20 or 30 people in each group, we can kind of trust that randomization is going to really take care of those potential issues for us. If we have smaller groups, then the pre-test, post-test design might be more helpful. We also have one other issue here. So I'm going to move myself down here so that we can see this. And this is the case that our pre-test, post-test design is going to be helpful in one other situation, not just when we have smaller groups, not just when we don't have truly random assignment, but also in the case that people might drop out of our study. And people might drop out of a study for all different kinds of reasons. We know from when we talked about research ethics, good research ethics, our participants can leave our experiment at any time. They're there voluntarily, and they're only there as long as they're comfortable, so they can end that experimental situation if they wish to. But sometimes we might find that experimental design, that people might drop out of our study differently depending on our experimental design, and especially if we're testing something that's going to be a more long-term study, something longitudinal, where we might study people at different time periods over the course of several months or several years maybe. We have this idea of attrition or mortality, and these are these terms that we use that are related to people dropping out of the study. And sometimes attrition is related to the experimental manipulation. And so the groups might be the same to begin with. At the beginning of our study, we have everyone is looking good, our groups are looking equivalent on all of the factors that we're interested in and all the factors that we think might make a difference for our results. But if each group has a different attrition rate, then they may wind up being different later on. And we wouldn't know that unless we had a pretest. And specifically, the fact that this attrition rate would be different for different levels of our independent variable would be a confounding variable. And so in order to eliminate that confounding variable, to make sure that we're aware of if attrition might become an issue for us later on, we have to have this pretest to be able to look at the difference between before and after our independent variable is introduced. And so, for example, if we're running a study that looks at a treatment to reduce smoking, and our dependent variable then is going to be how much do people smoke, we might consider the fact that if we measure people beforehand, we're going to get an idea of how much they smoke before our experimental group gets introduced to their treatment option. And so our control group in this case would maybe not have be getting any kind of treatment. They would just continue living their lives the way they normally do. But our treatment option, maybe they're going to have some kind of cognitive behavioral therapy. Maybe they're going to have some kind of medication that's going to try to help them reduce or eliminate smoking. What we might find in this case is that the heaviest smokers in the experimental group might be more likely to leave. They might have a harder time with the treatment program, and they might decide to drop out. If we only give the post-test, then in our treatment group, only the light smokers would remain. And so if we only have a post-test only design, we're going to have, okay, we put our smokers into our two groups. Control group is going to keep doing what they're doing. Our treatment group is going to have some kind of therapy or medication. And if we have attrition, then again, the heaviest smokers who might be more likely to drop out of that experimental group, at the end of the day, when we run our stats, that's going to leave the lighter smokers in our treatment group. Even if our treatment doesn't work, that might mean that it's going to look, when we compare that post-test only design, where we measure our dependent variable at the end of maybe 2 weeks or a month of testing, we see that our control group might smoke more than our treatment group. And we might determine from that, oh great, our treatment works. Except it could be that our treatment doesn't work. It's just that the heaviest smokers dropped out of our study, and so it made it look like our treatment worked when it really didn't. If we had taken a pretest in that situation, we would be aware of this. And so we'd be able to look and see, okay, well, who dropped out of the study? And do those people look different than the other people, than the people who stayed in the study? So I'd be able to see that, okay, if I have my pretest, okay, it looks like the control group is smoking more than the experimental group. It looks like our treatment lessened smoking, but oh, who dropped out of the study? Oh, well, these people were light smokers to begin with. And I can actually maybe take a different score or compare these statistics in a different way to account for the fact of how much people smoked to begin with. And so this pretest in this case would be really, really important for helping us to avoid this confounding variable, to identify that this is a confounding variable and to adjust our statistics, maybe rerun another version of our study. And so we'd have to have that pretest in order to be able to make these adjustments. And so continuing thinking about our pretest post-test design for a minute, we can see that it's really useful in some cases and really important to have that pretest in some situations. But there are also some disadvantages to this pretest post-test design. And so some of these disadvantages include that it's more time consuming. We have to make sure to give this pretest, and that might be, that's going to inevitably take up more time than only using a post-test. It's also possible that the pretest may change participants' behavior. And so using this pretest might be repetitive or awkward. It also can make participants aware to some degree of what we're studying, and that might influence their behavior in the experiment. And so we can think about that in relation to something that we talked about last lecture, thinking about things like participant bias and how participants' expectations might change how they act. And if we're studying behavioral science, we're trying to see how people act normally. Anything that might change participants' behavior and make them act in a different way than they might otherwise is going to be a problem for our studies. It's also the case that results might not generalize to situations in which participants didn't take a pretest. And so in the case when we're thinking about kind of, okay, so how do our results generalize and what other situations do our results apply to? Our results might not generalize to situations where these people didn't take a pretest. In everyday life, we don't have these kinds of pretests. And so in a situation where someone is taking this test twice, there might be learning that occurs just from taking the test 2 times. There might be other thought processes or other things that might be related to taking this pretest, and we're not going to be able to know for sure without specifically looking at if the pretest affects behavior. And so we kind of come back to this pattern that we talked about last class. And so we have this pattern where we have a method, and then inevitably there's going to be some kind of problem or disadvantages associated with that method. And there's going to be pros and cons to all of these different kinds of methods and all the choices that we can make as we're designing our study. And so usually, though, we're going to consider those disadvantages and we're going to come up with some solutions as well. And so there's usually some kind of method that we can use in order to minimize any kinds of disadvantages that might be coming from the original method that we're looking to use. And so in the case of our pre-test, post-test design, we can minimize the effect of our pretest, or those negative effects specifically of our pretest, by disguising our pretest or by assessing the impact of a pretest. There's a design specifically called a Solomon four-group design, and this combines post-test only and pretest post-test designs. We're not going to talk really specifically more about this Solomon four-group design. Your textbook goes into more detail about it, but this essentially is going to help us to be able to tell the difference and be able to see if there's an effect of the pretest and make these kinds of comparisons. And in the Solomon four-group design, essentially what it's doing is it's giving a pretest post-test version of this to half of the participants and a post-test only version of the experiment to the other half. And again, we won't talk more about it, but you should know that the Solomon four-group design is a solution to one of the main problems of giving pretests. And so that kind of wraps up this little section talking about basic experimental design. And so we talked specifically about post-test only design and the pre-test post-test design. In the next video, we'll think about between subjects and within subjects ways of assigning participants to our experimental conditions.